Hi, this is Dr. Megan, the Prednisone Pharmacist, and I'm here with Emily, who is at Losing the Prednisone Pounds on Instagram. She has a story to tell about how to function while on prednisone. So, first of all, Emily, we'd love to hear, what is your prednisone story? How did you end up on prednisone?
So it was actually close to 3 years ago. I started developing issues kind of in my nasal region, which you can probably tell I've got a facial deformity now as a result of kind of my disease activity. But I was over a 6-month period trying to figure out what was going on with my health. I was feeling terrible. My energy was terrible. I'd have these wicked nosebleeds, horrific headaches, wasn't sleeping properly. The list kind of went on and on. And finally, about 6 months into my symptoms, my physicians realized that I was dealing with an autoimmune condition. So I have an autoimmune condition called granulomatosis with polyangiitis. And basically, it's just a fancy term to kind of describe, I have my immune system attacks the small blood vessels in the center of my body. So it started with my nose. It has since moved to my trachea. I have something called subglottic stenosis, which is essentially where the disease is causing a narrowing of the opening of my airway. So it's been preventing me from being able to breathe properly. And then if the disease degenerates, the expectation is that it moves to the lungs and eventually to the kidneys. And once it's in the kidneys, without some type of transplant intervention or without responding to medication, the expectation is that there's only a 2-year life expectancy. So I was diagnosed in October, finally, of 2017, and immediately put on 60 milligrams of prednisone as just trying to get the flare under control. And within 3 days, it was incredible. Within 3 days, my body finally responded and the pain was gone. And what I had found was the pain was so intense, my fatigue was almost originating from the pain from the disease. And so, to be honest with you, just the intervention that prednisone kind of provided on an acute basis was remarkable for me. And it's not something that, like, even looking back in how challenging it's been staying on the drug over the course of the last 2 years, and it's been at varying doses. It hasn't been at the very high dose that I started kind of integrating into my life initially, but certainly there have been a lot of challenges that have gone along with being on the drug. But I cannot look back on the time and even the challenges without kind of recognizing that it was pretty life-saving for me at the time.
Yeah, I mean, prednisone is such a miracle that it can take you
Yeah,
from such a terrible state and like completely make your life better overnight. Like, it truly is such a
truly.
miraculous drug. So you mentioned you were on 60 milligrams. Is that the highest you've ever been on, or?
That's the highest I've ever been on. And my goal in life is to never have to get back to that level, because at the time, I would take it at 2 doses during the day. And so not at a 12-hour interval. I was doing probably a 6-hour interval. I try and take it as soon as I woke up. And I work in the financial market, so I'm at my desk at work before 6 a.m. my time in the morning. So I'm up very, very early. And I would try and take it before noon, because of the higher the dose, obviously there were huge impacts to my sleep. So
Okay.
the instant impact of like the effect on my cortisol meant that I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning every single day. And so my goal was just to get down to a dosage level that I could do 1 a day and kind of remediate the sleep, because I felt like a lot of the other issues related to the side effects from prednisone come from the initial lack of sleep, from the insomnia. And I wasn't one of those people that, I maybe had 1 or 2 months where the euphoria, like people talk about euphoria when you initially start on prednisone. I wasn't one of those people where the energy would just sort of sustain me throughout the day. I was really suffering with the lack of sleep. I live a pretty intense life as it is. Right before my diagnosis, I just finished my MBA, work easily 12 to 14-hour days. Not with huge regularity, but at the time I was working an enormous amount. And so in order for my brain to function properly, I really needed the sleep. And what I found with the prednisone is that it just really interfered with my ability to kind of restore myself. So as much as it helped the pain and allowed me to kind of get back on my feet after being really sidelined for a good 5 or 6 months, I had some pretty significant issues just that I hadn't, kind of unintended consequences, I guess, that I hadn't really anticipated once I'd kind of started the high doses. So for me, the biggest thing was just get it down to 30 milligrams a day or lower. And that process took close to a year because of the tapering. And because obviously I was in such the acuteness of my flare was so kind of dramatic that they were quite concerned about pulling me off the high doses immediately. They really wanted to make sure that the disease activity in my blood vessels had kind of settled before they made the decision to start tapering. So
that makes sense. So I completely agree with the sleep. I think that was the most disabling part for me. It was just with no sleep, then there's no like good attitude, and there's no willpower,
exactly.
and there's no it just goes on and on. So and
you're hungry, right? Like, so
you're hungry.
The hormones that so you're hungry anyways, because the drug has an insulinogenic impact, basically. Like anytime you eat, the postprandial glucose effect would kind of result in your blood sugar just remaining elevated throughout the day. That was the other thing. I felt constantly like I was kind of on a roller coaster. And I was a really healthy eater before I was diagnosed. And so like having the swings in blood sugar was not something that I was used to. And what I really found is that the heightened blood sugar would actually, it wasn't even just a mood thing, which certainly like my mood was impacted by the lack of sleep. I was just edgy constantly. I felt very brittle. But beyond that, I found that my anxiety increased exponentially and probably also a contributing factor was the lack of sleep. But certainly what I noticed is with the bumps in blood sugar, I would have really kind of massive surges in anxiety. And something I would just have to like moderate myself through. So for me, the biggest goal was just to get the dosage down to a level where I could take it once a day. I think part of the reason that they had broken it up was because I was having some gastrointestinal impacts from the drug. They wanted to try and make sure that it can really constipate you. It can really create kind of, impacts to just regularity. And so I think they were trying to moderate some of those impacts, not destroying totally the gut lining by taking the big dose all at once. But certainly because I had to take it twice a day, it just meant that my blood sugar at that dosage was elevated much higher than I was kind of typically used to, which I found really challenging at the time. So
yeah. So what did anything aside from lowering the dose help with your mood or your sleep that you found?
So I really dove into the research. I dove into the research as it related to autoimmune disease. So the funny thing about autoimmune disease is that it doesn't, as much as it creeps up on you, you have a lot of warning signs kind of along the way that this is developing in the body. You're not digesting food properly. You might be bloated. Typically, people with autoimmune issues have really major gut issues. And for me, that was certainly the case. I would really react when I'd have certain proteins. So certainly in the literature, there's a lot of evidence around, lectins or different types of plant proteins really interfering with certain, vulnerable people's digestion. And that was the case for me. So dairy and gluten were huge contributing factors. But beyond that, I just felt very, very tired. I would have kind of recurring nosebleeds at the time, but they were nothing compared to the initial flare that I had back in 2017. But I never felt like I could kind of get my pep back. Like I just never felt like it's hard to describe, but I knew what myself felt like. And I'm a pretty type A person, so I know the level of energy I normally bring to everything in my life. And it just wasn't there. I was kind of in this low, doing everything I could, but just feeling like I couldn't kind of get my energy going. And so the first thing I did once I was diagnosed was kind of dive into the epidemiological literature, dive into, I'm a physician's kid, so I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to this kind of stuff anyways. And the other thing is that as soon as I was put on the drug, prednisone has a pretty terrible reputation. Like, regardless of whether you've been on it or not been on it, I think there are a lot of people that know people that have been on it that have gained an enormous amount of weight. And that was something that was a fear for me. I just didn't want to feel like I wasn't in somewhat of a control of my life. Like, when you're sick, you just feel like you're not in control of anything. And I was kind of like, you know what, there has to be a way to kind of mitigate the side effects. So when I dug into the literature, obviously, as it relates to the drug, when it comes to weight gain, the two kind of largest culprits are the bump in blood glucose that results in huge increases in insulin. So insulin is the fat storage hormone. And so I knew just based on that kind of physiological response that I was going to have to be really careful around my diet. So I did a lot of research about kind of keeping my blood sugar as low as I could by eating as low carb as I could. Not because I'm really like religious by any stretch of the imagination about sort of a low carb lifestyle. I'm not an adherent, but it just scientifically made sense to me to not exacerbate the blood sugar issue by putting higher glucose containing food items in my diet, I guess. And then I also was kind of cognizant of the fact that the other way that people gain an enormous amount of weight on this drug is through sodium intake. It obviously impacts your electrolyte balances. And so I knew I was going to have to monitor kind of my salt intake very closely. So in diving into the autoimmune literature, I also was researching, there are autoimmune protocols, and there's a number of literature, and it's not, when they talk about the lifestyle for people with autoimmune diseases, it's not purely diet. A lot has to do with sleep, a lot has to do with circadian rhythm, a lot has to do with movement, but in a way that's gentle and not kind of aggressive and will raise inflammation levels in the body. And so I really kind of dove into that to just try and control the controllables. So for me, it was like, I wasn't going to let the illness define me. I wasn't going to let it, it's going to be something that I live with for the rest of my life. It's just the reality, but you can still make your quality of life as good as you can make it. And for me, it was just the start of a process where I just experimented and self-experimented. And I think the thing that people need to understand is what works for me is not going to work for everybody. I really believe strongly in it. You have to go by how you feel. You have to go by how your body reacts. For example, in the autoimmune protocol literature, there's a heavy emphasis placed on vegetable consumption. And I actually find an enormous amount of fiber consumption very disruptive to my energy, my gut. I just don't feel very well. I get very bloated. And so I still consume vegetables, but more as a hormetic application. In other words, in small doses to kind of just strengthen my body and get it used to things that it maybe doesn't like, but not indulge in it in a way that the literature says is good for you. A lot of the literature basically espouses, eating upwards of 100 to 200 grams of fiber a day, and the healthiest people in the world have adhered to these diets and lived a very long time. Well, for me, I just listen to what works for my body, and I just think that that's really important for everybody to do that. So to answer your question, 20 minutes later, to answer your question about what I was doing, that's kind of how I started. I was interested enough to kind of just dive into the literature and do research, and then I tested things out as we went along. And obviously, 6 months to a year, once we started tapering off the 60 milligrams and I could get down to one dose a day, one of the things that they advise when you're on prednisone is to obviously eat every time you take medication to kind of mitigate some of the impacts of, the negative stomach side effects. And so once I was able to go once a day, I kind of actually started diving into things like fasting literature, intermittent fasting literature, to try and figure out, because it's not just food that will impact your blood glucose levels, it's also the frequency with which you eat that can keep your blood sugar levels kind of elevated. And so once I was in a position to be able to do this, I actually kind of moved to 1 meal a day.
Wow.
A large meal a day, but I do 1 meal a day just to kind of keep my blood sugar as regular as I could keep it throughout the day. And the other thing that was so interesting about doing that is I'd eat first thing in the morning, so it would give my body a chance to digest properly. And by the time bedtime rolled around, I found that my sleep, like the deepness and the quality of my sleep, actually improved exponentially.
Really?
Because my body wasn't spending a lot of energy digesting food. My body could actually heal itself when I was sleeping. And so, and I felt that, like I could, given that I was still really kind of in the acute throes of the illness, I could feel that the quality of my sleep was much improved by kind of moving to 1 meal a day. Now, like, this isn't something that I obviously advocate on a regular basis for people that aren't on the drug, but certainly as a mitigating impact to the blood glucose. And the other thing is, when your blood glucose is high, you're hungry all the time. Like, why do people talk about prednisone being something that, you know, forces you to put an enormous amount of weight on? It's because when you have higher levels of blood glucose and your insulin goes through the roof as a response to that blood glucose, and then it plummets once it's kind of done all of the fat storage activity that it needs to do. When you have that insulin crash, that's when all of your food cravings kind of arise. So that's when you get hungry. And what I would notice is that moving to 1 meal a day, and a substantial meal a day, there needs to be a focus on nutrient density when you're sick. There needs to be a real emphasis on trying to get as many bioavailable vitamins as you possibly can. And I personally, for myself, have always had better luck with nutrition through my food than I have with supplementation.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like, you know, I was starving myself by any stretch of the imagination. I was being very cognizant of making sure I was eating enough. But the hormonal impact of just eating that 1 meal and then allowing my blood glucose to kind of settle throughout the day meant that I was more focused, less hungry, less of the anxiety that I was talking about, kind of related to higher blood glucose levels. And then my sleep was better. So all of that together. And then I would get out for walks and try and get into sunlight. I live in Canada, so sunlight in the winter is very hard to come by up here, particularly during the workday. There's less. I go to work dark, and frequently I will come home and it's dark. So there's not an enormous amount of sunlight. So as it relates to circadian rhythms, I would just do the best that I could, but certainly on weekends, get out, try and get some of that morning sunlight to try and get your body into a rhythm so that it's actually sleeping a full 8 hours. On the prednisone, it was definitely not sleeping. You know, like for long stretches at a time, it would be maybe 1 or 2 kind of REM cycles, but that was about it. So.
Yeah. Oh, you covered so much amazing stuff. Like, how do I follow up with that? I think for a lot of people, there are so many important concepts there, but the number one thing is, how does that 1 meal a day, like, how come you're not hungry when you go to bed? How can you fall asleep with an empty stomach, right? Like, how can we comprehend that if we've never tried that? Can you try to explain that for us?
So for me, it's all about managing expectations. And I think that when you, and I would say even now, it's about managing expectations. So to answer your question directly, I had done a lot of research. Dr. Jason Fung is probably one of the foremost kind of medical experts as it relates to intermittent fasting. He's a nephrologist out of Toronto. And so for people that don't know, that's a kidney specialist, but he would deal with a lot of diabetics who had damage to their kidneys. And he was trying to figure out, how can I manage the damage that these people are kind of doing? In large part, you know, particularly type 2 diabetes is kind of the direct result of a metabolic disease, and metabolic disease arises from obesity. And so he was trying to kind of attack the problem, not from purely a pharmaceutical intervention, but from a precautionary modality. And so he really kind of dove into the literature as it related to intermittent fasting. So I read, he has a fantastic book that I would highly recommend if anyone's interested in this, just about the science of fasting. And he certainly explained that when you're first trying these out, you stretch your muscles a little bit, right? So you start, a lot of people have, intermittent fasting is a huge buzzword kind of right now in pop culture, I find. And so what I find is if you've done, like most people have done a 12-hour fast without even thinking about it. It's the break that you have between dinner and breakfast every single morning. And you'll find that in the intermittent fasting literature, that is extended to a 16-hour window instead of a 12-hour window. So a lot of people just don't eat breakfast, and they'll have an eating window that's between noon and 8 p.m. as an example, and then they fast for 16 hours and give their body a break. And so he would extend this into longer and longer fasts. His advice was basically stretch the muscles, like try it out. And will you be hungry? For sure you'll be hungry, but you'll find that there's a peak level that hunger hits where it doesn't get worse after that. And in fact, because your body is so used to, it has almost its own circadian rhythm as it comes to eating, like an eating schedule, you can train yourself out of that. And so I went in with that in mind. I knew that I would be hungry. His sort of shortcuts to avoiding hunger when you're not eating kind of later in the day are to have sparkling water, have decaf coffee. For some reason, these two things seem to help with just making your stomach feel a little bit more full. But what I would find is over time, to his point, if you kind of used your fasting, if you flexed the muscle, you would get yourself into your own rhythm. So my body wouldn't panic. It would know that it's going to get fed every morning. It would get a big meal. There was lots to kind of digest there. But I found that eating in the morning kind of had the best impacts for me, also from an insulin perspective. The later in the day you eat, ironically, the insulin effects are actually more substantial than they would be first thing in the morning. You don't have as much of a blood glucose response first thing in the morning as you do kind of later in the day. There's weird kind of undulations to it. So it's just something that I kind of trained myself over time, but it's not there is a little bit of an element of discipline, I guess, but it's not, it's just something you kind of have to know what to expect when you're going into it. It's like, okay, I'm going to be hungry, but it's not going to kill me. And you get through it, and then you realize it's really not that bad. It's what you've made it up to be in your head is not that bad. And then you start feeling kind of the benefits of actually doing it. And for me, the benefits far outweighed the cost. And so it was kind of a no-brainer for me. For other people might find that it's a little too stressful in their system, like certainly people who are really sick on very high doses of prednisone, always eat when you're taking your prednisone doses. So if you have prednisone, if you have to take it by lunchtime or kind of later in the afternoon, certainly I don't advocate taking prednisone without food. But for me, once I was able to get down to 1 dose a day, that's kind of how I managed it. And for me, it was really a lifesaver. I certainly had a little bit of a pop in water weight kind of increase, and I'm still on 2.5 milligrams a day right now. I find generally for myself that once I get below 5 milligrams a day, I start kind of leaning out again, and I'm about sort of 5 pounds right now from my normal weight after 2 years on the drug, which I'm pretty happy with. My body composition has changed dramatically. I was below a 20% body fat when I got sick, and my body fat now is probably closer to 27%, I estimate. And that's largely just to do with the catabolic effects of the drug. So most people know that the drug is very bone wasting, but it's actually also very muscle wasting. And so for me, it was also imperative, even though I was exhausted from the lack of sleep, to get 30 minutes a day of some type of body weight or some type of exercise that would kind of help my bone density and help kind of maintain some of the muscle mass that I have. Obviously, over a 2-year period, you're not going to be able to do that. It's the catabolic impacts of the drug are just going to overwhelm you. But it was important to me to kind of maintain enough activity so that when I started over kind of trying to build muscle again, I wouldn't be starting totally from scratch. So
yeah. So what works for you? What are you doing as far as that exercise?
Yeah. So for me, the other thing is, up until roughly 6 weeks ago, I was in a position where my workouts were kind of limited to walking. Certainly since October of 2018, my breathing had gotten so constricted that I wasn't able to do anything kind of high impact like I had done prior to my illness. So my airway was just so constricted. I'm not sure if you can hear it now, but even when I inhale now, I have a little bit of a wheeze. And that's something that's going to continually get progressively worse over time. And so my surgeons tell me that I will likely have to have an airway surgery every year for the rest of my life just to try and keep my airway open. So for me, it's been about, okay, let's do what we can. Like, and that's all you can do when you're sick is like, don't try and be perfect. Like, don't try and have a level of intensity that's totally unsustainable. Do something that's actually good for you, makes you feel good, and is good for your body. And for me, that was walking. And I, like, when I'm walking, so I mentioned I live in Canada. We have snow 9 months of the year here. So I do have a gym in my basement just to allow me to get on and get some steps in, which I found has been really helpful in the winter months, but also really helpful because my schedule doesn't really allow me to, I'm not going to get up and go out for a walk at 3 o'clock in the morning before I go to work. So that's been really helpful for me. Once the airway surgery was done, I found that I've been able to do a little bit more high intensity circuit training. So just trying to get some of my muscle tissue back. But because I'm trying to lose the last 5 pounds, my calorie deficit right now is probably going to prevent me from I don't want to be wasting any more muscle than the drug has kind of already wasted. And when you're in a huge calorie deficit, your body's not going to be putting muscle on. If you increase your heart rate too high, you actually could break down muscle because your body looks for glucose as something to eat as opposed to burning fat, which is really the state that you want when you're trying to lose weight. So that's what's kind of worked for me. But again, it's just been, my rule is just show up. Like, I think that what happens with people who are sick, it sucks. Like, you absolutely cannot deny that living with a chronic illness is it's a real cross to bear, but it's a reality. And the sooner you kind of just get on board with the fact that, yep, this is what it is, whatever condition you are in on any given day. And there's certainly days I wake up and I'm like, ooh, I can tell that I'm getting on the very edge of like flaring, or I can tell that like too much additional stress is just going to throw me or my health kind of over the edge. And so I'm very careful on those days to not overdo it. I'm careful. I make sure my nutrition's on point. So I'm eating well and nurturing my body. But I think that needs to be, like, the self-care thing is so important across the board. Like, there are days that exercise will not be the most ideal thing to do. And so for me, literally the mantra is just show up, get out of bed and show up for your life in some way, shape, or form. Don't let life happen to you. You have to make life happen for yourself. And nobody's going to do it for you, even when you're sick. I mean, certainly I've had an enormous amount of help. I have friends and family that have just been incredible, who have assisted along the way. But really it boils down to showing up, doing the best you can, and not sort of giving up on yourself. And that's kind of what I've really tried to live by the last couple of years.
That's fantastic. So you're eating one really nutrient dense, delicious meal, and you're exercising 30 minutes. Are you kind of doing those back to back, or you kind of separate them? Like, what does your schedule look like?
So it honestly depends on the day. I generally, now that my breathing's kind of opened up a little bit, what my surgeons have told me is like, I will wake up sometime in the next 3 to 6 months and my airway will be closed again. Like it's not something that's going to happen gradually. It's something that the inflammation will just get to a point where I can't breathe again. So for the time being, I'm just trying to get as much strength back as I can, because basically when I can't breathe, I can't move. And when I can't move, everything atrophies. It's almost worse than when I was on the prednisone, to be honest with you. So what I do, I have to be, like I said, at my desk prior to 6 in the morning. So I try and be up by 4 in the morning to get some type of activity in. If that doesn't work, I'll do it immediately after work. Like I had mentioned, because I don't do dinner at the moment, it frees up an hour in kind of an ordinary schedule to get onto the treadmill. What I find, and this is just like, this is really sort of a personal decision. Everybody can do it on what works for them. It's not sort of a physiological decision. It really, for me, has boiled down to when I wake up, I don't want to instantly be reactive. I don't want to be responding to emails. I work in a very intense client-facing business where I'm constantly responding to emails where, there's a lot of asks of me. And so in order to start my day on the right foot, I find that taking control of my day means I start my day on my terms. And for me, that's always meant a workout. And for me, I'm also someone who's trained my body to kind of be, it's the energy is the best first thing in the morning. I find my focus is the best first thing in the morning, but also my energy is the best first thing in the morning. So if I want to get a workout done, generally I find that is the best time for me to do it. Like I said, there are exceptions. I will wake up some days. I'm still on other medication at the moment that does have some negative side effects. So I'm on low dose chemo on a weekly basis, which I personally have like a horrible reaction to, and I'm not sure why that is, but I just find that I wake up lethargic and grumpy, and I never feel well. And, people hear the word chemotherapy, but really, I'm not on such high doses that I should be having this kind of a reaction. On those days, I'm really gentle with myself. I don't get up and don't force myself to do a workout. I give myself the extra hour of sleep. And, I'll run a bath or do infrared sauna sort of later in the day to kind of sweat the toxin out, just to help myself feel a little better. And generally the following day, I'm kind of back on somewhat of a normal schedule, but I guess that's what I mean is like, there's going to be days you wake up and you can tell you just don't feel 100%, and you have to be really careful to not, at least someone with my type A personality needs to be really careful not to be overdoing it, because those are kind of the conditions that led to the autoimmune disease in the first place. So.
Yes. Oh, I can totally see that. So you wake up, you're doing this great workout, you're having time that is disconnected from the stress so that you can really harness every minute of that precious time for you to give back. And so do you prepare your meal next, or like when are you preparing this food?
So I have found that doing one prep day a week has sort of served me the best for a number of reasons. One, you can control your intake that way. Particularly if you're in a situation where you're trying to lose an enormous amount of weight, I have always found that the most efficient way to lose weight is by controlling intake rather than trying to exercise it off. Particularly when you're sick, you want to be very cognizant of the energy that you're kind of spending on a daily basis. Many people who have autoimmune disease know about the spoon theory, which basically says you have a finite amount of energy, and however you allocate that energy at the end of the spoons, you've run out, is essentially the theory. So for me, doing food prep is, I get it done kind of in one fell swoop, but then on top of that, I can be very kind of cognizant of what I'm actually putting into my body. And it goes the other way too. If you're underweight, or if you're at a place where you know that you need to make sure that you're getting sufficient nutrition, it enables you just to be completely in control of what you're putting into your body, both on a macronutrient perspective, micronutrient perspective, a caloric perspective, and depending on how your body functions. If it functions better on certain macronutrients than other, then it allows you to kind of plan again instead of being reactive. I find so much of my day-to-day stress is managed just by being organized, as organized as I can be anyways. And then allowing for the flexibility of knowing there could be a day tomorrow where I wake up and I just don't feel well. And so knowing that my meals are ready to go in the fridge, you know, I'll do it maybe on a Sunday. It's not something I have to worry. It's not one more thing that needs to be added to the list on a day that maybe I'm not feeling great. So for me, that's been kind of the best mechanism. Freezer meals, do it.
Yes, that is so fantastic, because I was trying to add it all up. I'm like, you're at work at 6 and you're waking up at 4 and you're putting in a workout. When do you prepare that delicious one huge meal? So you
I don't have kids. I will say that. So that's helpful.
That does help. Like being able to put in that much intense work during the rest of the day, right? So you have like a Sunday afternoon and you've shopped for your food. And so you're really managing your energy by not having to do a workout and prepare food every day.
Correct. And it's not even like, for me, I'm someone who has no problem having multiples of the same meal in a week. Like leftovers are not an issue for me. Some people have like issues with leftovers. They want sort of the novelty of doing a different meal every single day. I'm not one of those people. If I feel like something, like I'll certainly, you know, if I feel like smoked salmon or some type of shellfish, or if I, you know, feel like steak or whatever it is, I will incorporate that into my meal planning in some way. I believe that the body has kind of an intelligence that will tell you when it wants something, or when you're craving something, that it needs some nutrient out of whatever it is that you're craving. But the best part about it for me is once that decision is made, there's no more decisions to make about what am I going to eat today. Like I find that so much of the energy that's spent, it's not even about the food prep. It's about what am I going to do today? And it, you know, there are days that you've already had a 10-hour workday, and the last thing you want to do is go home and make dinner. And that's when poor food choices happen, right? You will stop at the fast food joint. And there is certainly a place for fast food. I'm not saying it should not be a part of your diet. It just shouldn't be a staple in your diet, particularly when you're trying to heal yourself. So for me, just like I said, being organized has been the best way. It just takes all of the stress out of it. Your meals are there, you just grab and go, and that's it. You know how many calories you're intaking, you know what you feel, you know what you're going to be eating, and you're done.
You're making the decision once, and you don't even have to think about it.
That's it.
Because that's really one of the other things about prednisone is it's stealing your willpower with the insomnia or with the hunger, craving, roller coaster, all of that. Like you have a depleted willpower. And so if you make the decision once a week, this is what I'm going to eat, you prepare it. Yeah. And that's just a great strategy. I think that more people on prednisone could use to really not have to stress, not have to worry. Okay, all right, what have I eaten today? I'm not sure. Can I afford to eat this? I don't know. Yeah. Like you've already decided. That is fantastic.
And put yourself in a position to win, right? Like I think so many people on prednisone just feel like they have no control over any part of their life. And for me, I just sort of feel like if you can control the controllables, and if you can do it in the most efficient way possible, in a way that kind of really limits your energy expenditure on a daily basis, you are totally setting yourself up to win and to show up for yourself that week. And so, yeah, for me, taking the mindless things out of the equation on a weekly basis is just a way I set myself up to win. I don't have to think about what I'm going to eat. I know that I'm getting sufficient nutrition. So I know that I'm really going to mitigate my hunger. And also for me, like a strategy has been just eating low carb to keep my glucose and my insulin as low as possible, so I don't have the hunger cravings. And then I've incorporated the fasting, and just getting yourself into as much of a routine as you possibly can is the way that you just set yourself up for success, in my opinion. So yeah, that's what's worked for me.
That is fantastic. And what, so can you go through like what that food would be? Because you mentioned that it's low carb. You've mentioned that you'll listen to your hunger cravings, or to your body's signals.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned that you incorporate vegetables, but not a ton of them. So
Yes. So I have no problem kind of doing a roasted vegetable like medley, which for me has for so sweet. For me, what I will do is literally I will buy a pile of different varietals of vegetables. Again, whatever I'm kind of feeling like that week, but generally I'll do peppers, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, a little bit of broccoli. Broccoli doesn't 100% agree with me. Some of the cruciferous vegetables are a little bit challenging for my body to digest. Onion, I'm trying to go down the list of what I'll kind of throw, you know, what you would typically have in kind of a roasted vegetables. I'll sometimes do beets, I'll sometimes do carrots. That would be sort of as starchy as I would kind of allow myself to get. I generally will stay away from starchier vegetables like, plantains aren't really a vegetable, but potato, even sweet potato, I found when I was at the height of my dosage would have an insulinogenic effect on my body. So I would kind of just stay away from the starchier things and focus on kind of what's considered low carb vegetable, and that it just doesn't have a huge glucose response, I guess. So I will chop those up and throw them in the oven to kind of roast for 45 minutes to an hour, just depending on, let them do their thing. And for me, it's just a personal preference. I love the flavor of kind of roasted veggies. And then I will have some type of protein source on the side. So if I was doing a lower fat protein source, like a chicken breast or seafood of some kind, be it whitefish or otherwise, I would always try and incorporate some type of good fat in my diet as well, whether it's avocado oil or olive oil, something to just, fat is very satiating when you're not eating a lot in the way of carbohydrates. Protein is very satiating, but your body only uses so much of it. So, and for me, I found, particularly actually with the autoimmune disease, you burn through amino acids so much that I generally consume higher protein than I think the average person, just to sustain my bodily function. But certainly if I'm not consuming carbohydrate, I need to have some ratio of my diet that's fat, not ketogenic macros. A lot of people think that low carb instantly means that you're ketogenic. Ketogenic diet involves as high as 90% fat as a macronutrient ratio. And certainly there's a lot of applications for ketogenic diets that are therapeutic, including epilepsy, et cetera. But for me, that was kind of unnecessary. And also I found that my body just didn't function well on that much fat. I'm just someone who needs a little bit more protein, but certainly some fat in my diet is satiating, and that's something else that kind of helps with hunger. So protein sources for me run the gamut. I'm not someone who dislikes nearly anything. And I won't just do muscle meat. I'm someone who, again, having looked into kind of the literature when it comes to nutrient density, I have an understanding that offal meat or organ meat is hugely beneficial and really nutrient dense. And so I will incorporate some organ meat into my diet, not just muscle meat like steak or chicken or, you know, kind of your usual suspects that you'll have for dinner. And then on top of that, brain food is really important. So typically autoimmune patients are very deficient in vitamin D. It's something that was really first noticed in multiple sclerosis patients, but it certainly seems to run the spectrum of autoimmune diseases that vitamin D deficiency is an issue. And again, because I live in Canada and the sun exposure is just not an option for us for many months of the year, I'm very cognizant of making sure that I get vitamin D in my diet in some way, shape, or form, usually with fatty fish. I'm a huge salmon person, so I'll do salmon for sure. And then as far as the brain is concerned, it loves shellfish. So mussels or shellfish in general. I've taught myself to like lobster. I never used to like lobster, but certainly I found that shellfish is really rich source of vitamin B12. It's really good for energy and for my brain seems to function best on these types of proteins. So I know it sounds very strange to have lobster for breakfast in the morning, but there are some days that I would do that. So
that's awesome. I mean, what we eat for breakfast is just this random cultural thing that we just threw down, right? Like it really doesn't mean anything. Like why sugar, cereal, and milk? Like who made that up? So yeah, you can get used to eating a full like protein meat source for breakfast. People have done it in many cultures, and just because in North America we haven't done it for the last 100 years doesn't mean you can't.
Yeah. I think for prednisone people, and I mean, this is going to be a very general blanket statement, but in general, if you're on high doses of prednisone, I just think that starting the day off with some type of sugary or starchy food source, that's kind of part of what is considered the standard American diet. I mean, people talk about that all the time, but I just think it's one of the worst ways to set yourself up to feel good during the day. And like, for me, that kind of is the guiding principle in how I make all of my choices. How do I feel afterwards? Do I have energy? Can I kind of show up for myself and participate in life? Like, it really doesn't boil down to a certain weight. It doesn't boil down to a certain gene size. It doesn't boil down to what I look like per se, although certainly when you're dealing with things like moon phase or extra facial hair, or all of the kind of nasty physical side effects that come along with the drug, it certainly dents the confidence a little bit. But for me, it really boils down to, is my brain firing? Am I quick? Am I sharp? And physically, how do I feel? You're never, again, manage expectations. You're never going to feel 100% when you're on the drug, but do what you can to feel the most like yourself when you're on the drug. And for me, that just involves keeping the sugar and the starch low so that my insulin stays low, and starting the day off with just like really good nutrition. And it's what's worked for me. Other people may find that, they are able to tolerate higher insulin or higher kind of glucose foods than I do, but my insulin sensitivity, I certainly have a response to certain types of foods that I've learned over time that I just try and avoid now, just to feel good. It's not something that I tell other people, you have to avoid this food, it's terrible. I fully recognize this is the way my body works. Mm-hmm. So people have to do what's best for them.
Exactly. I think you have really tied it up with a beautiful bow there. Like, you've got to control what's controllable. You've got to just listen to your body and find what works for you. You've been through quite a journey finding how that you can win as much as you possibly can while on prednisone. And I think much of what you said is completely applicable to everyone on prednisone. If they make that same choice, they can feel that same way. And so I just really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
So welcome.
So is there anything you want to leave us with aside from what you've already inspired us?
Oh, you're so sweet. No, I just think that people probably need to understand that they're stronger than they think they are, and they maybe have a little bit more control over their lives than sometimes they feel that they do, and that they can do it. I don't think that I'm an isolated case. I just think that, listen to your body, listen to how you feel, and do what's right for you, and don't follow, totally conventional wisdom and think that you are completely off the wagon for doing something your own way. Just do what works for you, and nobody else has to live in your body except for you. And I remind myself of that every single day. So just do the best that you can. And the other thing is, when you start doing these really small little things, what I find is a lot of that self-confidence that you lose once you're in a state, people who are on this drug are really sick. So once you're in a position to kind of take a little bit of control back, that self-confidence does start to manifest itself again. And for me, I just believe so strongly that doing hard things, even if it's giving up the sugar cereal, keeping a promise to yourself is such a good way to build self-confidence when you are in a position where a lot of your control in life has kind of been taken away. So it's just try and do the small things, be kind to yourself, be gentle, understand that there's going to be days that you feel absolutely terrible, and just make a promise to yourself to do the best that you can, whatever that looks like. Even if it's just getting out of bed, you got out of bed. It was a win. So that's the only advice that I have is don't be kind of have a religiosity about diet. Don't have a religiosity about it has to be a certain way. Figure out what works for you and just do the best you can. And that's it. That's all any of us can ever do as we're trying to get through this journey they call life. So
yes, yeah. Just show up.
Just show up.
That's fantastic. I love your motivation and your outlook on life, and good luck on all of your upcoming health challenges that you've mentioned on Instagram. And if you want to follow her, you can follow her at Losing the Prednisone Pounds, LBS, on Instagram. And she's got some amazing content there. So signing off as Dr. Megan, the Prednisone Pharmacist.
Awesome. Thank you so much.